So I have been toying with the idea of starting a fashion brand, and the name of the line is called Modern Madras. And I think the impetus to start Modern Madras was because in all my travels, I noticed that a lot of cultures had culture wear that they had modernized and reimagined. And as a Caribbean person, a West Indian, I didn't know what that was for me. But I knew Madras was something from my childhood, but I couldn't contextualize it. I couldn't tell you any details behind it, history. And so what I did was I spent time just researching. And in researching, I realized that Madras is really important to Caribbean people. Historically, it places us back into West Africa as far back as the 1700s, when trade kind of just started through transatlantic slave trade. And that was important for me because despite it having a European beginning, its ending was very African and Caribbean, because we were able to take what was given to us, whether it be as commodity for trade in Africa, and then make it some sort of a symbol or a status. A chief would wear a piece of Madras and it would symbolize his chiefdom. Or we would use it in ceremonies. And in West Africa today, it's still used in weddings, specifically in the Igbo culture, where there will be a plain George reception, and you'll see Madras, but it's not called Madras, it's called George. And that was interesting for me because I realized we're all sort of contextualizing Madras differently because we're all authenticating Madras differently. And by authenticating it, I mean, first you adopt it from the European culture or take it on through someone else. Then you add your meaning to it. And after you add your meaning to it, you add your customs to it. This is how it's supposed to be used. And I think we've never gone through the formal process of authenticating Madras. And so the bill proposed by Senator Myron Jackson out of St. Thomas to have an official Madras for the Virgin Islands, like all of this happening at the same time. And here I come and I'm like, Madras Re-Imagined has to happen, not just for my interest, but for the interest of everyone in the Caribbean and the Virgin Islands and St. Croix, because we have to help contextualize Caribbean identity. And in contextualizing Caribbean identity, we build up a national identity. And I think that's missing sometimes, where it's like, okay, I know I'm Crucian, and I know the history is a very blended history based on colonization. But what I'm really interested in is having a symbol, an icon, something that represents me. And I think Madras does that. So Madras Re-Imagined was bringing all of those ideas together and making sure that what was presented by all the designers was a representation of the best of what St. Croix has in artistry, in design, in model, in creativity, in photography. And it was really an epic show. And I want to thank all the designers that participated. Designs by Regal, Ahmad Fashion, Gregory Etienne, and Miss Llanos, who we call affectionately Miss Llanos. Her name is Zulma. You know, she started her brand as well. And we had an artist teacher present a piece out of paper. So Miss Nairis Walker's lovely design, where she created her pattern of Madras out of tape, paint, and paper, was really brilliant. So in reaching out to these artists, what I wanted them to do was reimagine Madras, not just for themselves, but really and truly for the public, to help them understand that it's not just a cloth, it's not just fabric, it's symbolic to who we are. It historically connects us to Africa. That's deep. It historically connects us to Africa, and it tells the story of transatlantic slave trade, because the cloth originates from India, and that's important. And in India, they built up a city called Madras, India, just to create the textile that was Madras because it was a lightweight fabric that was cheaper to export, and it was better on travel, you know. And all of these things led to the export of Madras from Madras, India, now Chennai, India, to West Africa, to the Caribbean. And so just the history of it makes me feel proud to be Caribbean, because that means my ancestors were doing the work to intellectually take what was given to them and tie their tradition to it and give meaning to it for themselves. And that is genius. Well, Madras has been on the runway. Ralph Lauren has used Madras. See, I did my research. Ralph Lauren has used Madras plenty times. And what I realized is Madras had an uprising in the 60s. You would see the white middle class and white privilege using Madras as their summer wear. Going to the Hamptons, it was a very preppy way to sort of express middle class or upper middle class privilege. And so I know that Madras will always have a very mainstream sensibility, right? It'll show up in major designers. So Caribbean designers need to take it back, and they need to reimagine it for themselves. They need to interpret it in a way that brings meaning to the traditions. So how I envision giving it meaning through cultural traditions here in St. Croix is looking at the practices that use Madras. So we look at quadrille, and we know that the women wear Madras, the men wear Madras, but the dance is structured. And so some of the pieces that I created were structured to resemble that. And so there's an artistic process that we are going through here in St. Croix amongst all designers and creatives to translate the old into the new with respect. And that's important. So I really want to respect what came before me. And when I'm presenting this idea of Madras Reimagined, it's not to do away with the old tradition, you know. It's to actually help my young students be able to connect with the new and the old, so that they have the space to reimagine. Because if they're in control of their destiny, and they are, I tell them that all the time, you are in control of your destiny. You have to bridge the gap between the now and what was for yourself. And that's what I'm doing through my fashion line of Modern Madras and Madras Reimagined. It's saying that I will never want St. Croix to be without its cultural foundation. That is what St. Croix is known for. But I need my students to be able to take an interest, and that interest may not come from them actually being a cultural bearer. It may be from them being someone who reimagines the culture. And I think that's important too. You can't have one without the other. You can't force someone to be what they're not. And some students don't necessarily want to be the cultural person. They want to be the person to reimagine it. And I'm an example of that for my students. Being creative as a black male is an interesting development if you grew up in a certain time period, right? Now, you know, you have the younger generation being as creative as they want to be, and they're like dressing quirky and weird, and you know, men can dye their hair and no one sort of like chagrins. They're just like, oh, okay, that's interesting. But there was a time when, you know, wearing clothes too fitted or tailored made people look at you. And so I grew up in that time. And so I would fight against being too outwardly creative, too outwardly interested in anything artistic, because I didn't want anyone to have to question me. But times have changed, and I'm an example of that for young men, that being creative doesn't mean that you're confirming a sexual preference. Being creative means that your brain works differently. It means that you're able to envision things in a way that many people can't. And because you have that talent, you're supposed to explore it. Because what may come out on the other end is, one, something that may make you tons of money, and two, something that solidifies your genius. And when you deny your genius, when you deny your talent, you starve your soul. And you should never starve your soul. The advice I would give to someone interested in going into design is to do some research. Not to make yourself smart, quote unquote, but to give yourself a reference point of how creativity in fashion sort of evolved. And there's two things that I realized. Fashion for a person of color historically is different, because what we were doing was taking what the master or the rich or the privileged, and we were taking it and making it our own from the beginning. That's why Madras Re-Imagined isn't so much of a new concept. It's just a new concept for us regionally here in the Caribbean, but African Americans have been doing it. When you look at hip hop fashion, hip hop urban wear has become the new couture, but when it started, it was seen as blasphemous. How dare the poor young black artist take my label, my Gucci, my Louis, and turn it into something so not what I intended it to be. And you've heard comments from designers that are alarming, but the money that was being spent by those hip hop artists on their brands finally hit home, and now they're catering to that audience. That's the kind of research I'm talking about. I'm not talking about just patterns and silhouettes and shapes. That's important, but also just the trajectory of what brought us to this point where we can say we can spend this much money on a garment. Are you supporting a brand that supports your community? Are you supporting a designer who has an interest in uplifting communities, plural, not just one? All of that is important to me. So some of the designers, I want to say look up to. One was Ralph Lauren. Ralph Lauren was not classically trained to be a designer, but he is one of the most important American designers because he defined American fashion at a time when there wasn't American fashion, quote unquote. And that really interests me, to be able to define something. And I think that's why I started the line Madras Madras, and that's why I wanted the designers to be a part of it, so that they were too crystallizing that we do have a national and regional fashion identity. And I hope it continues. I think once the weaver takes a pattern from something else and makes it that lightweight cotton blend and double sides it, because Madras is double-sided. You see it on the same pattern, shows up on one side, shows up on the other. So once a weaver takes the pattern, whether it's influenced by other patterns, and makes it into a Madras double-sided cotton blend, it's more Madras than not. Because tartan is wool. So when they took those tartan patterns and put them into the cotton blend, it wasn't tartan anymore. So, and the history is deep. In Nigeria, there's no conclusive reason why George is called George. So the idea is it's possibly because King George loved plaid, and so the African traders with the European traders knew it would be a big hit in commodity, so they called it George, so that people would know it was the thing that King George wore, which makes sense, right, in terms of sales. But it's also that Fort George in Madras was where a lot of the weavers lived. And because the weavers lived near Fort George, it was just symbolically easier to call it George because it was near Fort George. And those are the two main discussions that come up when we talk about Nigeria Igbo people and why they call Madras George versus Madras. It's because either King George at the time made it really, really fashionable for them, or Fort George was actually where much of the garments were being made. And the weavers near Fort George were around Scottish soldiers. Could you imagine this influx of ideas being shared through colonization? Which is why I tell people I love researching cultures post colonization, meaning after after the dominating power goes in and changes the language, the food, the fashion, and then what comes out after it. That's what we are exploring here with Madras. The dominating cultures, more or less, are not here physically. They're here in terms of capitalistic structures, but the Spanish isn't here as they were, the French isn't here as they were, the British nor the Danish. So in terms of fashion, what is left? And the most iconographic thing we have is quadrille, the costume of quadrille. It's the oldest thing, and masquerading. It's the oldest sort of iconographic stuff that we have. So in my line, you'll see some of the pitchy patchy that comes out in masquerading. I try to put that in the line as well. It is a lot of research, and there's a lot of thinking about it intellectually.